Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin, and I got my coffee ready. And today I'm very, very excited to have a conversation with Martin Woodward. Martin, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, Martin Woodward here, joining you from sunny Northern Ireland this evening.
Sunny Northern Ireland. What is the temperature there? Are we around?
Oh,
Are we
I
are we are
actually,
we up over?
well, it was. I don't know what it is in freedom units in Celsius. It was like about plus sort of 12 or 13, maybe getting
Oh,
up to
okay.
20 yesterday. But then today I just saw snow a second ago, so it's wildly flip-flopping right now. But there you go. It is that time of year.
Yeah. So how I do the calculation, it's like it's twice plus 32, right? Whatever
There you go.
whatever it is, I think it's actually not exactly that, but it's close enough. So, I mean, at the end of the day, like it's warm. It's starting to get warm there. And I think we have the same like similar temperatures here as in Ireland. I live in the Seattle area. So, the temperatures are
Yeah,
very
you live
similar.
in like the only part of the world where I visit, and I'm literally the only person going, "Wow, the weather here is fantastic."
Yeah, right.
Everyone in Seattle is complaining about the weather, and I think it's fabulous. So,
Yeah, I think that the hardest thing with weather is just the at least here, and I imagine it's the same in your neck of the woods as well. It's like just the general like gray, kind of like that kind of melancholy weather is what I like to call
yeah,
it. Um,
yeah,
but I think at the end of the day, it's always nice to have conversations with folks that have know what my temperature is like where I live, which is important. Yeah, so I again thank you for coming on the stream and chatting. I'd love to kind of get your origin story. So like that point in time where you came across tech. Depending on who I'm interviewing, it's people like if they got CDs in the mail or maybe their parents brought a computer home when they were younger. But do you remember that moment when you came across technology and you were like, this is the thing that I really need to be associated with the rest of my life?
So I was coding from a very early age. I had a VIC-20, and it was mostly to get, to do have something to do and to play games and things like that. I kind of came into programming though via electronics. I was much more enamored with getting lights to blink and building like circuits and then
Sure.
building up to like microprocessor things and things like that. And so kind of came at it from that angle and sort of understood it from first principles. And then so I was coding, did a ton of coding. And then I wanted to be first of all, I wanted to be a lawyer because I can talk a lot. And then I wanted to be a physics teacher because I had a really awesome physics teacher. And so why not be a physics teacher?
Yeah.
And that's, I love physics. Like that's kind of what I was doing. That was kind of my passion and all that sort of stuff. Um, and then while I was doing my physics degree, I was sort of gonna go be a teacher and all this sort of thing. And I was doing very, very kind of computer sciencey related projects. And I was like, hang on a minute. I could actually earn a job doing this computer sciencey stuff.
Sure.
And I could, in my first job out of school, I could earn more than kind of like my entire family have ever earned in their entire lives, sort of thing. So I was like, oh, maybe I should actually make this a job. But it honestly had never occurred to me to make it a job until kind of I was leaving uni, all set up to be either a physics teacher
Sure.
or like modeling. I did sort of astronomy and computational fluid dynamics. So it's like modeling either galaxies collapsing or modeling sort of airflow around a Formula One car. Like that was the path I was going to go down. I was like, oh, might as well go build software in for people. So I went and had a real job. I went and worked in I went to work for British Airways initially as a mainframe programmer to begin with,
Oh, wow.
and then did websites and did all that sort of stuff. And yeah, so that's kind of how I got into it. Was for the money, even though I'd kind of always been doing it as a passion in a side project on the side.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think a lot of folks too, they think about tech as like an interest like and I don't know when you got started in tech like from a career perspective, but I think in general like there's this thing about like the money is safe, right? Like it's not like you're working in a field where jobs can disappear at some particular point in time, right? So I totally relate to folks that are like, okay, if I get a job in tech, like I'm not going to be in trouble for the next 30 or 40 years, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I was always doing it as a passion, like on the
Yeah.
electronics side, and everything else has always been the hobby. And it still is today. That's how I relax, is with a soldering iron in my hands and doing some
Sure.
like crazy build or something. But yeah, get the money was definitely a reason for sort of taking it up as a career, and then kind of as it progressed, it was really interesting because I did through open source, and we'll probably dig into that.
Yep.
I ended up, because of my involvement in an open source kind of project, ended up doing a startup with a few buddies I met
Hmm.
over the internet, and we did that. Like we started that around 2004, and so I was leaving like, jobs in kind of, secure jobs as a sort of solutions architect in an insurance company and telecoms consultancy and IT consultancy, or that sort of thing. I was leaving that for doing a startup, and it felt
Sure.
like the riskiest thing ever. And yet when 2008 hit and we had that financial like crisis and stuff,
Hmm.
all my friends who were in banks and insurance companies were all struggling to find jobs, and here's me and my little startup still busy, working
Yeah.
away. So that was really fascinating. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think that was. Thank you for that, and that kind of led into the next thing I'd like to talk about. Right, we're talking about your proximity to open source, or like when you first
Yeah.
started working open source. Like, what was that first thing that you started working on that got you so excited about the idea of like sharing, and distributing, technology to all sorts of different folks?
Yeah, so again, it's completely selfish, if I'm honest. I
Sure.
was so this was back in like SourceForge days, is
Sure.
where I was,
Yeah.
doing stuff. And I was doing some Java work and getting involved with the Apache Geronimo project. And then different sort of projects I was getting a little bit involved with and using a bit of. Um, but then whenever I'm using, I kind of I've crossed this boundary between .NET and Java my whole career,
Sure.
to the point where I've even worked on the .NET team and
Yeah.
then helped the OpenJDK do stuff.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's like I've been like on that bridge for for my whole career. And so when I was doing one thing for work, I would always try and do some of the other stuff as a hobby project
Yeah.
at home for some open source to keep my learning in. And that's how I actually started doing this company called Team Prize, which is how I ended up getting a job and doing a startup and stuff. And so yeah, so really it was selfishly kind of working on a hobby project. Let's working on a library to do something. So I was on a Java project, so I wanted to do some unit testing in .NET as
Yeah.
as a hobby project in the evenings, and so I created like a an SMTP test harness class, so you could, if you were doing stuff that involved mail, I could call my SMTP server as a dummy server, and then within my test send stuff to the dummy SMTP server, and then I'd be able to, go in my test harness, go look at what I'd sent over to
Sure.
that test harness to make sure it done. So that was like probably the first project I maintained that actually had users and
Hmm.
like got a community, and I started
Yeah.
getting contributions from random people and people still using it like 5 or 6 years later, that when I'd completely forgotten I even started this
Sure.
project. So that was probably my first kind of one where I ran a project rather than just where I was a contributor to a project,
Yeah.
nervously watching a mailing list, kind of
Yeah.
listening to things, and then nervously sending a patch. Then it wasn't even pull requests. You're sending a patch in and saying, "Hey, I think this is okay," and then like the joy of that getting merged and accepted and becoming part of the code base. Yeah, that maintaining was probably a thing that took me a little bit longer to get into.
Yeah, and that's it's quite funny. Like the whole like you mentioned something that I've run into too. Like when you start to get like a project or a repo or whatever you want to call it, like people it starts to gain interest, right?
Yeah,
And then you have like random people that you'll never meet face to face more than likely that want to contribute in plethora of different ways, right? Like what was
yeah.
that like initial was it shock to you? Where it's like why do people care about this or was it like oh an epiphany of maybe there's other people that could make use of this tool and they just found me. Like what was your initial reaction to like, oh wow, my stuff is interesting to other folks?
So with that first project, it was very much like, how on earth did they find this? You know,
Sure.
like
Yeah.
I didn't set out to broadcast it. It was
Yeah.
just there, and people started using it. I was like, oh, I guess I should do this. With we had another thing. So I worked on the early versions of what became Team Foundation Server,
Hmm.
and I was doing Java stuff at the side. So I decided to go with build like a Java client for TFS, which was this Microsoft product, and would so it involved a bit of interoperability. And I'd done some work with Java talking to Active Directory before, so figured I could figure it out. So started doing some work there, and that was like the biggest shock, because not only were people like, we hadn't done anything, like I'd literally just got the Apache HTTP client stack to authenticate with TFS, because it was all
Yeah.
SAML based. And so I'd just got it, well, not SOAP based, sorry. And I'd just got it kind of authenticating, connecting, and when we'd kind of talked about what we were going to do. And we were featured in Dr. Dobbs magazine, and we were getting
Sure.
calls from people left, right, and center. I was like, whoa, this isn't sustainable.
No,
I'm
not at all.
literally spending like an hour a weekend. So that was where it was like, okay, well, rather than go and be an open source project, like, let's try and figure out how we make a business around this and
Yeah.
do a startup around it, and then create the project that way, because it was obviously much more demand than I had the time to fulfill in my little hobby of an evening, playing on things. So that was how I kind of got into that side. That was a big jump.
Yeah, and I imagine that's a dilemma that a lot of folks, that they have some idea that they turn into some
Yeah,
asset, and then it starts to gain almost too much traction, right?
yeah,
And then you realize, oh, quite frankly, like this is becoming work. And then there's like this paradigm shift where it's like, okay, you need to think about things like, okay, how do I want contribution to my project? Do I even want it at all? Am I
yeah.
okay with people creating issues? They need to be in a particular template. What do pull requests look like? Do they need to follow the same coding standards as I do? Like, you have to think about, like, okay, if I'm somebody new coming to a project and I want to contribute, like, what does that look like? And I know I'm very guilty of it. Like, creating projects, that's not the first thing that I think of, because I don't think intrinsically that people are going to want to pay attention
No,
to,
you're just creating
yeah,
something and
yeah,
sticking it in a repo just
yeah,
in case somebody finds it useful, mostly for your own reference, so that when you
yeah,
Google that problem later, you'll be able to find it.
yeah. I mean, and also, so I have a project called Presence Light that broadcasts like
Mm,
Teams presence to different smart lights, and
hmm
it's funny how, because I have telemetry, and I like the numbers that I see. I'm like, there can't be that many people using this thing daily. Like, there can't be. But I mean, unless I'm logging the telemetry incorrectly, but it's from the Windows Store, so I don't know how.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where you think about tools that try to make people's life better, because that's what we're trying to do in tech for the most part, especially open source. Like, there's two paths to take, like for a hobby, like you were mentioning, and then trying to figure out some revenue stream, like you also talked about, right? Like, for you was one of
or
the,
if you want it,
yeah, yeah,
sometimes, like I say, like, there's stuff I do, and it's just a hobby project. Like,
yeah,
I'm not interested in this. I want this to be fun, and I don't want
yeah,
it to be my job. I want it.
yeah,
It's just thing I'm playing on, and I try and set expectations clear. And if
mm-hmm,
people want to take it and run with it, fine. But this is what I'm doing. But there are other times where you're so interested in a problem, you can't help yourself but work on it.
sure,
And then you start doing that, and then if that gets community traction, and like other people are interested in it too and really coming to you, that's where you really kind of think, oh, maybe I could turn this into a full-time gig. How
yeah,
am I going to do that? Like, what am I going to do? And that like, those opportunities are incredibly rare.
yeah,
I was so lucky to stumble into one. Most people go, your entire career, and you'll never like walk into that. It's kind of like a lottery ticket scenario. But when those do happen as well, you're like, is this my lottery ticket? Like, am I going to grab this opportunity and run with it? Or is this the thing that's going to bankrupt me and, like, whatever, and is this going to be a complete disaster? And I was very, like, I came from, reasonably kind of working class background and things. And so the idea of, like, turning my back on this very secure job that paid money to going and starting up my own sort of company with a bunch of friends that had no guaranteed revenue stream,
yeah,
and you know where we had to like sell seats and licenses and
Sure.
things
Yeah.
to make the rent and to all that sort of stuff. Like that was a massive jump that was definitely very, very frightening. So yeah, but it was all good fun. Worked out in the end. It got me my job at Microsoft and things like that, which then meant I got my job here at GitHub. So it all worked out in the end. But it was definitely a tour. It wasn't a direct route, that's for sure.
Yeah, and that what you were saying brings up a good point. One of our listeners, Sam, in chat, he says, I'll paraphrase for him, but it's he wants to be
Yeah,
like he doesn't really he has a hard time, I guess, understanding like random PRs to his projects, right?
yeah,
Like so, like what
yeah,
is
yeah,
that
yeah.
like where is that when does the calculus have to take place, right? Where it's like, is this too much to bite off right now? Do I need it broken into smaller pieces? And like, how do you deliver that message without kind of sounding, quite frankly, like somebody who doesn't want them? Because I think one thing is
Yeah.
really fair in open source is that we do want contribution. We do want people to be interested, even in your like hobby thing. Like if people come and they find it valuable, like that's only beneficial to you, right? So
Yeah,
it's
most of the time.
yeah,
Most of the time.
most of the
Sometimes you're
time,
not, and that's fine. Yeah,
yeah,
but I've it's learned a lot from some of the sort of projects where I've worked with different people. There was somebody called Null Token, who was amazing, sort of ran a project that I was part of, and he was, fabulous in the way he did it. And then somebody actually, he used to work at GitHub, VMG is his handle. Again, amazing way of sort of accepting contribution and
yeah,
working with you. And so I kind of learned a lot from how they responded to pull requests and how like tricks, like polite ways of kind of
yeah,
saying, yes, that's a great idea. However, this kind of you've messed up the PR and it's now like wants to include every single change set. Can you please go figure out how to fix this?
yeah,
And it sometimes help me, but not don't feel like they have to. This is it's your project, it's your spare time, like you have to be protective of it, and so you kind of try and strike a balance between serving the community and also getting the community and building them up to work for you. So it's a really tricky balance. So and to answer Sam's question directly, um yeah, when it's like trying to split it down and turn it into a
yeah,
smaller one and get the test to pass and things, I quite often just let them sit there a bit as well. Like say, give them the feedback and say, hey, can you break this down into a couple of others? Maybe abandon this one and try again. And I've been on the receiving end of that kind of feedback, and
yeah,
I remember you get some people who be like, jerk doesn't want my stuff and never comes back, and that's
yeah,
fine because it was too much work to accept it anyway. But I remember being on the receiving end of that and being very grateful of being educated and feeling quite unworthy of this maintainer's time,
yeah,
and that's just they're just a person like you, but you feel quite unworthy of this maintainer. You think, oh, I don't want to cause you extra work, and so you don't mind, like you're learning, you're going to do what you need to do to go try and get it working. And yes, you will turn some contribution away. That and when you're trying to scale a project, from like a hobby project to, some of the biggest open source projects in the world, the difference between those is kind of how much you're gearing up your experience to
yeah,
not throw away any contribution. The vast majority of open source projects I've worked on, where it's just been hobby projects and things, most of the like there's so much wasted effort that's there because people are lurking on discussions, people are lurking on issues, people are lurking on PRs and mailing lists and things, trying to understand what's going on before they make a step and contribute. And whereas when you're working on a larger scale project, you're trying to funnel as much of that contribution into real live code as you can
yeah.
because you can now scale. So it depends what stage you're at. So I would say just be kind to yourself, Sam.
Sure.
Just take it. Don't worry. You don't have to fix it all.
Yeah, I think too, like there is, and I suffer from it, and I don't know if you do or in this case Sam does, but I generally get like I have feedback or contribution anxiety, where like
Yeah, yeah,
if my issues, like the number of issues is like a number that I'm not comfortable with, I get kind of anxious, right?
yeah.
Or if I have PRs to stay open for too long, I kind of get anxious.
You
Not,
feel you're letting
yeah,
people down. You feel
yeah,
like you're getting behind. It's debt. It's
yeah,
it's a weight on your shoulders. Definitely.
yeah,
And so I just
yeah.
bite the bullet sometimes, and close stuff and kind
Sure,
of try
sure,
and get through stuff. And also What advice would you give me as if I was in that situation? Would you tell me to
Yeah.
worry about it? Would you say I needed to get on with it, or would you tell me to just, it's all right, don't worry?
I mean, probably a bit more forceful when I work with contributors because one, I know that somebody, especially if I get like a drive-by PR, I
Yeah,
know that more than likely they won't contribute again to my project.
yeah,
More than
yeah,
likely.
yeah,
So in that case, if I see something and there's somebody's adding a feature that they think that might be valuable, right? Like maybe they're adding like something that I wasn't even thinking of, and I'm very appreciative because they see that there's a potential gap with what I'm providing and what they actually are looking for. But if it's something that's going to drastically make my life more miserable in contributing it, I typically say like I don't have the bandwidth to manage this. If I do,
mm,
I know I it passes all the tests. It is following coding standards, but like I can't I don't have the maybe I don't have the mechanisms to adequately test it.
yeah,
Maybe I don't have enough of the technology experience. Maybe they're using packages or patterns that I'm not familiar with or used to. So I'm very fine with saying like sorry that I can't take on this effort because I know you're going to disappear. I don't actually say you're going to disappear, but I say like I'm owning this long term. So if you want to
yeah.
help contribute or help maintain this area of my code base for a little bit, that's great. But I know that's not fair to ask everybody.
No, exactly. And
Yeah.
also, I've noticed I'm more rapid than some people I work with in just going, no thanks, like
Yeah.
in pull requests and things, to just say, I usually give a reason,
Yeah.
unless it's a totally
Of course.
spammy one, unless in which case I just close it.
Yeah.
And I've worked with people who like get really kind of, you can't just close it. You got to go, no, this is, I'm gonna put as much attention into reviewing this PR as they gave in creating it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if somebody's obviously gone to a lot of effort, then try and put, commensurate effort in. But if it's just like a total drive-by kind of spammy typo one, that I don't want to like not like the Hacktoberfest ones used to be, but not anymore.
Hacked.
Like this
I
year's
was
one
just
was
about to
great.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, but this year's was brilliant. But in previous years, it was just like one of those. I'd be like, nah, I'm good. I'm not going to merge that, And then,
Yeah.
but if it's one where it's like taking me where the where the design decision isn't quite what I wanted, and this is kind of how my philosophy of things, and this is how we're working, then I'll try and take the time to explain the design decision in the PR before I close it, but I'll still close it and move on because I've got 50 of these things to get through in the hour I've got that I've given myself to go work on this weekend. So yeah, just be kind to yourself is the main thing. Don't try not to let it build up. Anything you can do is better than nothing. So just do it and make sure it stays fun as well.
I think that's like the thing to primarily focus on, right? Like it's all about like your well-being and your health, right? Because unless you're
Yeah,
doing it for a financial avenue,
yeah. Unless you're doing it
like
for a job.
yeah, if you're doing it for a job, most definitely like you need to maybe be more aware. But if it's a side thing or something that you enjoy doing for fun, like if it no longer brings you joy, like to quote a show on Netflix, right? Like you just gotta get rid
Yeah,
of it. You just gotta get rid of it.
but there are times where so you find people who are maintainers,
Yeah.
they're volunteers, and you find these people are volunteers not just as maintainers, but you get type of people in life who are volunteers and who put their hand up and say, yes, I'm going to go solve this problem, I'm going to help. And then you get like a whole bunch of people who never do any of that kind of thing. And maintainers are volunteers,
Sure.
usually the nicest people you're ever going to meet because they are like that. And you'll often find it's not just like software, open source software where they're kind of volunteering. They'll volunteer at a local school, they'll volunteer for local charities. Like they're people who volunteer. And I
Yeah.
definitely like fall into that category. And sometimes you do kind of get guilted yourself about whatever kind of volunteering it is that you get letting something behind, and you kind of have to let some of that guilt wash over you a little bit so that you will set time aside to go focus on it and go do stuff and make progress and then move on. But it has to stay fun.
Yeah.
If you're not enjoying yourself, then move on. And no shame to you. While some people in the community might feel like you owe them, you don't owe them. You've
Yeah.
you've given them all the code, you've given them all the work, and they can take it from there if they want to. So yeah, make sure it's fun and have breaks.
Yeah, no, I mean the breaks thing is really, really important, right? Like it's okay to step away from a project for a bit. Maybe you'll come
Yeah.
back with some new insight. I would love to kind of, you mentioned a couple of things a little bit ago about some of the technology or some of the things that you've worked on in your professional career, right? And one of the things that you
Yeah.
mentioned was Team Foundation Server, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why particularly I'd like to talk about that is that the progression of that sort of technology need, like the DevOps, continuous integration, continuous delivery, like mechanisms, like there's been so much innovation in the last 10 years, right? 15 years of, now, like, you work at GitHub, so like GitHub Actions, right? Like went from
Yeah.
being announced to like the most, I don't want to say popular, most used like system in the world to do these sort of things, right? So like, and since DevOps is something that's, I think fair to say it's like in your area of interest, because I think you've worked in a bit of it in your career. Like, how well does or what would you say like is the catalyst for DevOps for a lot of folks? Is it solely just trying to make lives easier? Is it tooling? Is it technology? Is it culture? Like, what is the biggest like driver of success in DevOps?
So I think there are two things. I think the biggest driver of success when you're doing DevOps right is when you are trying to um, take the flow of value to your end users, your customers, so very, very customer centric,
Yep.
and just iterate on it and improve and try and get better at getting more and more value to your end users quicker and quicker. And that's all DevOps is. It's like this continual kind of improvement of doing that and continually looping. And that should be the driver for DevOps. However, when people think of DevOps, they often think about, all the automation that goes around it, whether it's like actions and doing CI/CD or automating there, or whether it's, Terraform or Ansible or Kubernetes and there's all these kind of ancillary technologies that people get
Yep.
into and like SRE and how do you do how do you manage live sites, how do you do postmortems, how do you have observability, and it's just there's this massive like collection of things you can do around this, but
Yep.
at its heart fundamentally all you're trying to do is just get better at your craft. How can you ship stuff better to your end users, and how can you keep the customer at the very, the end user at the very, very center of everything that you do, and you optimize for their experience the whole time. And then everything else just comes as you get more and more mature and more experience with
Yep.
DevOps. You start to bring up different technologies, but you're not doing it wrong. If you are doing DevOps and you're doing, I don't know, ASP, classic ASP, you'll
Sure.
say, or like or you're using like J2EE kind of, EJBs and all that sort of stuff. Like you can do DevOps and be using all those technologies and not be doing, your fancy stuff, fancy smanchy
Yeah.
things. You can still do an improvement. So I've been involved with teams like the Windows team and people like that, or the Office team, where trying to take these big monolithic products and take them from shipping every 2-3 years, ignoring Longhorn or something like that, like
Yeah.
in a good way,
Sure.
to shipping all the time and
Yeah.
getting how could deliberately re-engineering their products and their commercial practices so that you have a feedback loop that's customer focused that allows you to iterate on your product quickly so that you can get it better, because as we found, the only way of improving the product and making it work is to iterate on it, to iterate quickly, and to get live feedback on it so that you can tell if it's going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm always completely astounded at how fast like some teams can ship. Like they ship a new version of Windows every week, like to the insider team, right? Like that's like to me that blows my mind every single time. Or like even
It
like,
wasn't like that way.
oh, I
Like when
know.
we,
But
it used to take like, oh my, yeah. So it used to take, when I started at Microsoft, and I started in November 2009 was when, so I did this company called Team Rise, got acquired, joined Microsoft November 2009,
yeah,
and we had like a ton of open source experience, which is what we brought in. But what we also brought in was like we were shipping online. We were shipping to an Eclipse update site. We
yeah,
You could buy physical media from us if you wanted, but most people just went to an update site and downloaded it
yeah,
online. And I went from that to shipping software that was in like actual
yeah,
shrink wrap boxes, sort of thing.
yeah,
This is some
yeah,
software I worked on. And in fact, my first when I first started Microsoft, I had to go on a course so that I was able to approve the hologram that went on the DVD that goes in this box. You know, I
That's
was
funny.
like, bizarre.
Yeah.
But I used to run in and I used to see like the time to null ship, the minimum time it took to ship something was like 9 months, and then they eventually got it down to 6 weeks, and I thought that was revolutionary. And here I am, like, used to shipping every day, at least
Yeah.
multiple times, maybe multiple times per day. And I remember when I got the team down that we were working on down to shipping like every single day, the ability to have a same day ship, that was just like, how
Yeah.
can you
Wow.
do that? How can,
Yeah.
and but there's also, and you see this a lot in every enterprise organization I work in. People think, why are you doing things, you can't do that here because we are blah, we are Microsoft,
We are the special case. We don't need to do.
we are
Yeah.
the special case, we're a
Yeah.
bank, we're a whatever, like there's reasons, hand wave, well, we can't do that. You can't do that here, or why do you have to do this big long complicated process? Oh, because we're such and such, because we're a big company and blah blah blah. And so you got to like dig in and understand what those business reasons are, and then figure out how you get there and how you get to where you want to go, because iteration and being able to iterate quickly and get people's feedback quickly is what counts. In fact, from Microsoft's point of view, that was where a lot of open source came in, because it gave, like, if you work on the .NET team, is incredibly hard to get like people to use new versions of .NET. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Especially when they release and there's a whole life cycle and all that
Yep.
sort of stuff. But if you can get live feedback on every single commit,
Yes.
not even a build, but every single commit before it's been merged, that's massive. That gives you the ability to iterate and gives you the ability to kind of hone in on what the community needs, what your customers need, so much quicker than actually waiting until you've shipped products and then had people adopt them. So yeah, sometimes it's driven by that kind of feedback loop, the DevOps thing, the
Yeah.
ability to give feedback to people. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and even when you think about GitHub.com, right? Like a lot of people
Yeah,
don't think about it, but like GitHub.com is a product, right?
yeah.
And it just updates constantly. Like it seems like
Yeah,
every time I log in, I have like a new icon for some preview feature that I can toggle on and off, right?
yeah.
Like how, like, obviously, and I'm not and I'd be curious to know, maybe you have some insight if it's by design or not, but it almost seems to me like GitHub as a company, as a product, like had that vision into DevOps from the get, right? It seemed like we need to be able to ship constantly. We need to be able to bring value as soon as possible. Like, from your experience, like, was that been baked into the culture, or is that something that was kind of adopted maybe 2 or 3, 4 years of the business being around?
I think everything like that goes in waves,
Sure.
and that's what, because I've like done startups and I've done enterprise software and I've done
Yep.
like legacy software and I've worked in big, and one of the things that I hadn't done is like done what they call like the one who's born in the cloud, like a startup that's got really big, that was always in the cloud, always
Yep.
delivered to the cloud. And what's been fascinating is there's still like the DevOps and the continuous improvement need is there, and you still
Mm-hmm.
build up technical debt in areas,
Yes.
and you still build up process debt in areas as well. So
Looks like we have lost Martin for a little bit. Let's see if he comes back. Right. See if
sorry, I think I lost you then for a second. Hopefully you can see me
Yeah,
now.
you're back. You're back now. So we lost you for
And I've
about
lost
10.
your audio as well, Isaac, by the way. I
You
can't
lost
quite
mine.
hear you, so I don't know if that's my end or your end.
It might
Give me
be.
1 second.
Thank you for being patient, folks. Can you hear me now, Martin?
I can hear me. In the chat, if we've got any questions, if you can hear me, I'd be excited to know, or if you can
Yeah.
hear
So
Isaac.
so
He
Sam
can hear us
says,
both. Well,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
even more amazing. Hang on a
yeah,
second.
yeah.
That must be on my end that's going wrong. Speaker. Da, da, da. Give me 1 second. I'm going to switch to a.
So Okay, all right. Let's see if we can get this going.
I can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
There we go.
cool.
Don't touch
Let's
anything.
don't touch anything. Don't touch
Right.
anything.
What were we
Cool.
talking about?
All right.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the feedback. What were we
Um,
talking about?
so you were talking about companies that are born in the cloud.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the GitHub journey and all that sort of stuff. It's been on a journey. So, but the processes you need for having a team of say 20, I've found in my career, whenever you go up by an order of magnitude, so say from 20 to 200 and then from 200 to 2000,
Sure.
you need a completely different set of processes and kind of like different structures in place to allow you to still engineer at the speed and velocity you want to do
Yeah.
and scale up to support different people. And so we've definitely changed kind of like the life cycle as it's gone. But it's also been remarkable how much of the core infrastructure in GitHub has remained kind of scalable to support this growth.
Sure.
So, like the basic CI and sort of pull request, that process has been re-engineered a few times. And the way it works now is it's kind of like a post merge deploy is kind of what
Yeah.
happens. You go in chains and then it gets deployed. But early on, it got deployed before it was merged into main because
Oh,
that
okay.
was the test. That was how you knew if it worked. Does it work in production? Yes.
Sure.
Okay, right. Well, let's push this into main. But that meant blocking kind of main for a little while,
Yep.
things, and so that doesn't scale. So anyway, it's been fascinating seeing that. But the thing that has survived in GitHub, the thing that GitHub's got really good is kind of their feature flagging infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
is fabulous. And so we have this amazing thing where you can come in and enable features to sort of 2% of users, 1% of users, specific users, and then you can say, right, go from 1% to 50% and look for errors, and if any errors happen then stop,
Yeah.
and all this sort of stuff. And so yeah, the feature flagging infrastructure that they have is just absolutely, still to this day, is scaled enormously well. Now we have built up feature flag debt because now you have a lot of feature
Yeah.
flags in code. You have a lot of
Yep.
feature flags which are in the database which aren't actually being used in code anymore, and you have to go back and clean those up and set up actions to go clean them up and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's been really interesting. It's been a great journey coming along and seeing how it goes. But hopefully you've seen the team's velocities keeping on increasing, and
Yeah.
it goes in waves. Like we had some, we've hit some issues with like MySQL and stuff like that, which has meant we had some availability problems the past couple of weeks. But we're getting on top of those again. We will get on top of them, and then there'll be another wave, and then we'll hit the next kind of bottleneck, and then we'll see what happens. And that's how it works.
Yeah, I mean, the GitHub journey is fascinating to me because obviously, when it first created, it was just basically a web wrapper for the Git technology, right?
Yeah.
That's like
Its
oversimplification, but
original hosting line was Git hosting that isn't a pain in the A in the
oh,
butt.
really? Very
Yeah,
good,
that was its
very good,
original marketing tagline. So
very
yeah, there
good.
we go.
And now like you see it, very quickly moving into this whole developer tools productivity suite, right? Like
Yeah,
whether you're talking about repos still or projects, which are
yeah,
issues of projects and discussions to be able to have conversations that aren't quite issues or aren't quite pull requests, and
yeah.
then moving into like these developer centric things like code spaces and actions, and github.dev. Like it just seems that in the last like 3 years, it seems there's been like this huge push just for enhancing the developer experience or increasing developer productivity. I'd love to get your thoughts as somebody who probably was a part of some of those initial conversations. Is the ultimate goal to be a one-stop shop for all the primary use cases of developers, or is it as seeing an opportunity that doesn't quite exist in the market and filling in a gap?
I think it's an interesting one because it is GitHub. It's the central place where you can integrate things together and build
Yeah,
them. So I think it's building the core collaboration capabilities that you
yeah,
need, that by doing in the platform, we can build the appropriate kind of network effects and things to make it work really well for you. That only works really well if it's part of the platform. But I think there's a conscious effort to leave plenty of scope for people to build in add-on services and connect, and
yeah,
like leave plenty of room in the market because uh, GitHub one of the things about that Microsoft developed and that GitHub already had, I don't think Microsoft had this for all of its career, but it did kind of towards the end of when I was working there, and GitHub always had it, is GitHub does not assume that the smartest people in the world work at GitHub.
Sure.
GitHub assumes that their customers, their end users, the community are smarter than them.
Mm,
And so they know that, like, if we build the fundamental building blocks, our community will build like stuff we've never even dreamed of. You know what I mean?
yeah.
So, like, what building blocks do we need to provide that allow them to do stuff? So that's things like, whether that's things like actions, again, built in a very building block way that was open and extensible. Is that things like sponsors, so we can start to get a revenue stream? But as we do
Yes.
that, how can we open up the platform to Patreon and to, open collective and things as well? So it's not just stuff, some of the security tooling, how can we build these in so that we build security tooling that we can give away for free to open source projects, but we also create a platform by which other security people can come in and build things? So it's kind of, how can we build these building blocks that then allow people who are smarter than us, who are in our community, to come in and put them into the workflows that they need. So no, but it's been really, it's like, yeah, the growth and kind of like the features over the past year or two has just been phenomenal, and
Yeah.
it's fun to try and keep up with, as as somebody who uses the product and tries to has to helps to teach people how to use the product and things. It's definitely fun times for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always surprised. I'll be going through my typical GitHub workflow since, my
Yeah,
organization, the company I work for, we use GitHub Enterprise, right? And I use GitHub for personal or hobby projects. And
yeah,
it's just like I'll be navigating and I'll just see something that looks completely different. And I'm like,
yeah,
oh, like this is awesome. Like I think
yeah,
one of the like on being able like the changes that were done like in the changes tree, like being able to
yeah.
see things like stuff like that where I'm like I don't even remember what it used to look like because only in my brain it should look like this, right? So I
Yeah,
think,
that's when you know you've done it right. That's the
yeah,
same with any UI, where
yeah,
you've got it right, where it kind of just disappears. Occasionally we move the cheese, like we to introduce a feature so that stars can be used not just to star, but actually allow you to categorize what your stars
yep,
are, so you can
mm-hmm,
start to create lists of things,
yep,
Um, to build that feature, again, that's how it should work. Everybody's like,
mm-hmm,
yeah, well, of course this is how it should work. That's how it should
yeah,
always work. But to do that, what we had to move, like, a shortcut some people had, where they would click on the star button to see who are the follower who'd starred this repo. And so we kind of had to move that down a bit into sort
yeah,
of like, there's a little menu where it's got your code of conduct and your license and things like that. We had to move the people who are the star followers. We had to move that down there. And that can kind of be disruptive sometimes. And
mm-hmm,
so what we do often, especially when it's a UI change, is roll it out to a small percentage of people, measure how many people are having trouble, how many people are still doing fine, make sure those percentages are okay, and we're not sending like we're not sending everybody down a horrible
yep,
loop, and then start to increase the percentage of people that get this. Or if it's an even bigger UI change, you'll quite often see it in beta for a long period of time, and then we closely monitor the opt-out percentages, because if people have tried it and then opted out, it obviously isn't working for them.
sure,
And UI is like a joke, right? You can think a joke is as funny as you like, and you can
yeah,
try and explain it, but if you have to explain it, then it's probably not working. The same's true with UI. It can be the smartest, cleverest UI you've ever dreamt of, but if you have to explain it to somebody, it's probably not working for them. And so if they've switched it off, that's a great indicator that you haven't got it right yet. So back to the drawing board, try and make it better, and then look at the opt-out percentages the next time, the next iteration.
yeah. I mean, I think UI is like a lot of things. It's completely subjective, right? Like we've
Yeah,
all came across like experiences that we thought were terrible, but then like you realize they probably won awards for user experience, right? Or even
yeah,
to knock on something like, and it's not a knock, but like modern art, right? And I
yeah,
don't know how often you go to like a modern art museum, but like I'll go and I'm like, that's just a canvas with a hole in it. Like, and in my head, I'm like, I just don't get it, and that's okay. But some people think it's like this mastery, and I think what's interesting about people with all the people, everyone has their own different tastes and enjoyments, right? And I think as long as we can continue to ensure that everybody feels like they're being spoken to in the way that makes sense for them, that's the real goal, right? So like
Yeah.
putting a bunch of effort, like you're saying, into making sure, yeah, like there's a ton of canary experience that we can put on here. Make sure that the experience for everybody is always going to be positive, or not always positive, but as much positive experience as possible. Um, I do think one thing as well that's quite interesting, and I would love to get your thoughts on it. So in GitHub, like obviously it's a web page, so people have
Mm.
taken upon themselves to write like extensions for browsers to kind of
Yeah.
modify the experience, or do additional plus one things that GitHub doesn't do.
Yeah.
And I've seen over the course of the last 2 years or so, like some of these features kind of get brought natively into GitHub. So
Hmm.
how often, from your perspective, how often does GitHub kind of monitor that browser extension ecosystem, and look to see if there's things that, oh, like this particular extension has 500,000 5-star reviews, like maybe we should look to incorporate that into the platform. Like how often does those sort of conversations take place?
Not as much as you'd think, actually.
Okay.
I think those sorts of there's a sort of a few things wrapped up into that same thing. One of them is that we probably need a better UI extensibility story than we have.
Sure.
Kind of, it's an area that we know we've got feature debt on, if you like, and
Hmm.
it's hard to extend the UI in a way that makes sense. And so people resort to these browser extensions, which are then very fragile. So we've had a number of times where we'll upgrade and we'll break people's browser extensions, not realizing it because we don't use those, we don't test them, and then they complain to us that a feature stopped working that isn't even a feature we created, but they didn't
Sure.
realize we were getting it from a browser extension. So it becomes like this supportability nightmare, you know. That said, they're also an amazing indicator of pain that your customers have that you've taken so long to
Yeah.
address that somebody's gone and made the effort of like making this plugin, and then thousands of more people have gone to the effort of figuring out that there's a plugin available and installing it. Like that's a significant pain. And
Yeah.
so there are times there where it does it. Usually though, um, the team were already aware of that pain existing. Just trying
Sure.
to implement it for them was non-trivial work that needed to go get done, especially to do it the GitHub scale, because that's one of the biggest things that's been sort of like fun for me to go do, is working at this scale now, because there's a big difference from creating like a browser extension or creating a plugin or creating something which works with a few thousand developers kind of
Sure.
thing, to when it's working with sort of 73 million, or so
Yeah.
however many it is, over 70 million developers. And the load that that puts on the site, kind of the impact that has to databases and things like this. So yeah, it is fascinating. It's like it's this double-edged sword. You can Every single change you make, and we make changes every second to the website, but every single time you make a change, you're making somebody's life a lot better. And
Yeah.
at the 70 million plus scale, it only take if you can save a second, like you've saved like entire lives of people in the world
Yeah.
just by improving the performance by a second today. But the downside of that is if you mess up everybody's day, and all
At
of a
scale.
sudden they're
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? So it's a massive, massive privilege, but I'd be lying if the responsibility of it doesn't weigh on you at times as well.
Oh, sure, but with great power comes great responsibility, right? Like
Indeed,
to
yeah,
quote from a
yeah, but
movie
it's
somewhere.
great fun, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh,
And just it's just and the impact you can have on everybody's life by just doing stuff. And like you can kind of, it's often not the most shiny like things that can really make a big impact, and but you can just kind of like push people in, like
mhm,
gently nudge people into a more brighter future. Like giving Julia Ferreira had an idea one day, why don't we make codes of conduct have a bit more prominence in the UI? I was like, yes,
sure.
that's a good thing, let's
Yeah.
do that. And then people are like, ooh, how do I get one of those codes of conduct badges? Oh, I need to add a code of conduct file to my repo. Okay, I will do that. And it's just like, how can we kind of gently nudge people into this better, brighter, more inclusive future? How can we make sure features we add are including more developers in more countries and more parts of the world rather than excluding some things? It's just, yeah, it's an absolute privileged place to work. And for somebody like me who's, you know, come in, whose career's always been around open source,
Mhm.
it's just the best place in the world to kind of just sit and, I get paid to help open source projects be
Sure.
more
Yeah.
successful on GitHub. Like, there isn't a better job for
Yeah.
somebody who does it. You know what I mean? Like,
No, I
it's
totally
just
agree.
phenomenal.
It's also one of those things too where the amount of conversations you get to have. I mean, like, you mentioned like just being able to you make one change and you'll get feedback, positive or negative, instantaneously, right?
Yeah,
And you can
the data tells you.
course
Hmm.
correct, or and even like sentiment stuff. Like I'd imagine there's a good
Yeah.
amount of sentiment that like, people,
Oh,
hey,
yeah.
this feature got launched today. Let's go and check Twitter to make sure people aren't screaming about it. Like, there are some other well-known social media platforms, because I think GitHub to an extent is a social media platform for developers. Um,
Hmm.
but there are some social media platforms where they'll make some changes or add features or change UI, and the overall response from the community is this is absolutely the worst. And
Yeah.
I don't see that with GitHub. I see people more excited about the capabilities that are being added. Not to say that
Yeah, we
not,
occasionally mess up. I'm
yeah,
trying to think of an example. But I think we do make mistakes from time to time.
sure, of
But
course.
I think a lot of the time, though, by the time we've got to 100%, or by the time we've come out of beta, um, we've generally tested it with enough people, and we've got
Hmm.
enough data. We've got enough kind of anecdotal feedback that we're fairly confident it's good. We don't just like, though we do make changes like multiple times. I say roughly every second, but definitely every minute of every day, there's a
Yeah.
new version of the website getting deployed. But we're then using the feature flags to test those changes and make sure they're going okay, and then expand. And we're fairly deliberate in switching things on, but occasionally we do, and we mess up, and people are like, oh, this has gone horrible. That star example was a great example. Like, there were
Yeah.
some people who used the fact that clicking on stars give them the star followers, and they just didn't see this button down there because it was in an area of the screen that they were ignoring because it
Hmm.
had had no value to them previously. Like, those people definitely complained. Every time you do something. My final one is like, my funniest one is, no matter what the random most amazing feature is you can think of, is measuring the time to first finally, on a post.
Oh,
And like, so somebody does it, and you do like, hey, we've added telepathy into this
yeah.
thing, which is basically what Copilot is thinking about it. But anyway, we've added telepathy into GitHub, and finally, I've been asking for this for
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, well, we just got around to it today. Sorry.
Well,
But yeah.
it's quite funny how after something's been introduced, people say, "Oh, I've been thinking about that for 5 years." It's like, have you though? I mean, like
The
it's
ideas are not, well,
yeah,
probably have, to be
yeah,
honest. And you can, it's probably been on the backlog for about then as well. Oftentimes it's not, so I was program manager for a long time, and the idea is usually the easy bit.
yeah,
It's figuring out how to do it in a way that you can afford to build it quickly, that will
sure,
scale, that can do all this stuff. It's like, it's actually building it's often the hard part. And that's again true with open source. The idea, the feature is the easy part.
yeah,
But if you show up with code that actually implements it, code talks more than anything else. And that's kind of, that implements it in a way that aligns with the rest of the system, that has minimal impact on the system, that one bit of code change actually solves not just your specific use case, but a whole category of problems, like by
yeah,
just changing something small. Then that's when you've done it right. And so, yeah, making adjustments to GitHub is very, very similar to accepting pull requests on your own open source
sure.
project, for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's great. I'm gonna ask the next question I'm curious about, and you can say,
Yeah.
"No, I don't want to answer it."
Okay.
I would love to hear. Obviously, you don't need to spill the beans on any great things that GitHub hasn't announced yet. But what do you see like the future of GitHub as a platform? Do you see it continuing down this path of just continually adding great experiences for developers? Do you see it as something more as that? Like, and you can be as transparent or opaque as you want, but I'm generally curious, like like the vision of GitHub for developers, and what are some of the things that the team is thinking about right now?
Go to GitHub, go to github.com/home. GitHub
Yeah,
is the home for developers, and
yeah,
that's what we want GitHub to be. Um, like, how can we make this a great place where people can collaborate, where we can increase the ability for people to give value and build software, where we can increase the numbers of people that can actually get into software development and start building stuff. So yeah, GitHub just wants to be the home for software. Like, how can we help people build things? And then I think there's a whole bunch of like interesting technology spaces. Like there's on the action side, down the automation, what can we do there to improve it? How can we make it even better? How can we like add different features in the additional building blocks? Code spaces is another great example where it's this like a whole category of problems is around setting up development environments. And if we can get to the point where we can make it super easy to have your development environment checked in as code alongside with the code, and that'll not only make enterprises make it easier for them to build software, for if we can get that working for open source as well, and make it so much easier to contribute to an open source project, which will mean more open source, which will mean more software that people can build and more collaboration. And then you've got like longer bets, like things like Copilot and stuff, where it's like, how can we take all this learning and in a responsible way with AI, how can we take some of the learning and all that data and actually give it back to you as value and save you having to do lots of Stack Overflow searches and lots of Google searches? How can we help you get real-time kind of code suggestions and code
yeah,
feedback and all that sort of thing? So yeah, there's the future, and then there's like security as well. Like there's so much stuff we can do in that space. Building secure code is just too hard today.
yeah, yeah.
And how can we make that better so that people can build more secure code, but you don't notice it? As developers, we hate planning tools. We hate Jira. We
Sure.
hate anything that makes us track our time. How can we build tools which make that fun for developers? So it's all about developers. Developers are at the center. It's not going to become like Office or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's the tool for developers by developers to try and make their lives fun and be able to help us have the world have the most impact for the amount of time we have left, because we all have a finite number of keystrokes in our hands and a finite number of breaths in our bodies. So how can we help people get the most out of those and have fun along the way and make friends as well?
That's great. I mean, that's probably, in my opinion, the best way to end this conversation, because I think like the story of GitHub, and you're a big part of that, is to empower developers to do the things they want to do. Because technology,
Yeah,
at the end of the day, it's dependent on the people that are building technology, right? Like you
yeah,
can have, the fastest chips or the whatever, right? But
yeah.
if you don't have developers that can leverage those tools or leverage those technologies, it's just sitting there, right? And I think
And it's also
that's,
about building a community of people you
yes,
want to hang out with, building a space where it's full of people that you want to spend time with, behaving in a way that you want to be behaving in. You know what I mean? It's about
yeah.
building a space you want to hang out. And a lot of people who live at GitHub and who work at GitHub are there because of the community around GitHub and just want to make it a better place because that's where they enjoy hanging out and that's the people they enjoy, collaborating with and building things with. So it's how can we make that better for sure?
No, that's awesome. All right, so the last question that I have for you before
Okay.
we sign off is, um, at the end of our shows, I like to ask my guest if they can summarize kind of the technology, open source, the community around it, and they only had one word to do that. What word would that be for you?
For the technology and open source and
Tech,
everything around open source.
yeah,
Wow. Um, it's playful,
playful,
inquisitive.
inquisitive. Oh wow, no, I like that one because, yeah, like there's nothing better than just learning, right? I think that's,
Yes, if
yeah,
you finish the day smarter than you
yeah,
started the day, it's been a
yeah,
good day, regardless of what happened. And the whole yeah, so this learning by doing, by playing, by experimenting, that to me is what it's all about. That's the community I enjoy hanging out in anyway.
That's great. And again, Martin, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and chatting with me. For the folks that aren't already following Martin, you can follow him, Martin Woodward, on Twitter. I'm guessing it's also Martin Woodward on GitHub, I believe.
Yeah, and Martin
Uh,
Woodward everywhere. It's a
Martin
long
Woodward
name, but it
everywhere.
means nobody else has got it, so that's
That's
awesome.
right. That's right. And so I want to thank you for being on the show, and thank you for our folks that tuned in. And so enjoy the rest of your day and take care, everybody.